Right now, you're doing something no other species on Earth has ever fully figured out. You're understanding words, stringing them into meaning, and you didn't even have to think about how. Every human alive does this, but here's the problem. Nobody knows when it started. There's no fossil of a word, no skeleton holding a sentence. Language leaves nothing behind. It vanishes the second it's spoken. So how do you find the first language ever spoken? When the only evidence is something that disappears instantly. Every animal communicates. Birds sing, whales click, dogs bark, but none of them do what you're doing right now, building infinite new sentences out of a small set of sounds. So in this video, we're going to dig into 5 things. How scientists even search for the origin of something invisible and instant. The wildly different theories for when humans actually started speaking. What happens when children grow up with zero language exposure? The single genetic mutation some scientists believe may have flipped the switch on speech, and why some researchers now think language may have started with hands, not sound at all. By the end, you'll understand why some researchers think language wasn't invented gradually. It might have appeared almost overnight, on an evolutionary timescale. Here's the core problem. Bones fossilize, tools fossilize. Language doesn't. You can dig up a 100,000-year-old spear. You cannot dig up a 100,000-year-old sentence, so linguists and anthropologists get creative. They study the shape of ancient throats and voice boxes, the wiring inside fossilized skulls, and genes still inside living humans today. Here's the twist. For over a century, this topic was considered so unsolvable that in 1866, the Linguistic Society of Paris literally banned academic papers on the origin of language. They were tired of pure speculation with zero evidence. That ban stuck for decades, and it's part of why this remains one of the most contested questions in science today. So when did it actually start? Here's where it gets strange. The estimates aren't close. They're not even in the same ballpark. Some researchers believe basic vocal communication started as early as 1.5 to 2 million years ago, alongside early Homo erectus. Others argue true, complex language, with grammar and syntax, didn't appear until much later, somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, lining up with a sudden explosion in tool complexity, art, and symbolic behavior. That's a gap of over 1 million years between the two camps. In a field this uncertain, even the experts can't agree on the century, let alone the exact date. And here's a detail most people miss. This isn't a small academic disagreement. It's the difference between language being almost as old as our genus itself, or being a relatively recent, sudden development. Here's a physical clue that actually does fossilize. The hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone in your throat that anchors your tongue and voice box. In 1989, archaeologists found a Neanderthal hyoid bone at Kibara Cave in Israel that looked almost identical to a modern human's. That single bone reopened the entire debate. If Neanderthals had the same throat anatomy needed for speech, they may have been capable of spoken language too, not just Homo sapiens. But here's the pattern interrupt. Having the right anatomy doesn't prove you actually used it. Owning a piano doesn't mean you can play Beethoven. The bone shows Neanderthals could have spoken. It doesn't prove they did. Here's a question almost nobody asks. What happens to a human brain that never learns language during childhood? This isn't hypothetical. In 1970, researchers in California discovered a 13-year-old girl, referred to as Genie, who had been kept in near total isolation with almost no exposure to spoken language. Despite years of intensive therapy afterward, she was never able to fully acquire grammar the way a normal child does. This tragic case pointed to something scientists call a critical period, a specific window in early childhood where the brain is uniquely wired to absorb language. Miss that window, and full language ability may never fully develop, no matter how intelligent the person is. Here's why that matters for our bigger question. If language requires a very specific, narrow developmental window in the brain to switch on, that supports the idea that language isn't just learned behavior copied from others. It's a biological capacity, wired in from birth, waiting to be triggered, much like vision or walking. Now here's where it gets genuinely wild. In the early 2000s, scientists studying a British family with severe speech and language disorders traced their condition to a single gene, FOXP2. Family members with the mutated version struggled to form grammatically correct sentences and control the fine muscle movements needed for speech. FOXP2 exists in almost all mammals. Mice have it, chimps have it. But the human version carries small mutations that no other primate shares. Some scientists estimate these mutations became widespread in humans within roughly the last 100,000 to 200,000 years, suspiciously close to when complex behavior explodes in the archaeological record. This doesn't mean scientists found the language gene. It's more complicated than that. Dozens of genes are likely involved. But FOXP2 was the first solid biological thread connecting our DNA directly to the machinery of speech. Here's a theory that flips everything you've heard so far on its head. Some linguists argue language may not have started with sound at all. It may have started with gesture. This is called the gestural origin theory. The reasoning: early humans and even other primates already used hand movements to communicate intention long before complex vocal control evolved. Modern sign languages support this idea in a surprising way. Sign languages aren't simplified versions of spoken language. They have their own full grammar, syntax, and structure, just as complex as any spoken tongue. That tells us the human brain doesn't actually need sound to build a complete language system. It just needs a structured channel, hands, voice, or otherwise. So maybe the first words humans ever used weren't spoken. Maybe they were gestured, long before a single sound carried meaning. Here's the part that should genuinely change how you think about this. If language really did depend on a small handful of genetic mutations combined with a narrow developmental window in the brain, that means it might not have evolved gradually at all. Grunt by grunt, word by word, over hundreds of thousands of years like most people assume. It might have flipped on almost like a switch. A tiny genetic change spreading through a small population, landing inside brains already wired with a closing window for language acquisition. And within a few thousand generations, a blink of an eye on an evolutionary timescale, humans went from making sounds and gestures to building entire civilizations out of sentences. In other words, the thing you're using to understand these words right now might exist because of a handful of tiny copying errors in DNA, millions of years in the making, that just happened to land in exactly the right place, at exactly the right stage of brain development. So go back to the original question. When did the first language happen? Honestly, we still don't know the exact moment. No fossil, no recording, no proof. But we know the ingredients were there. The right throat, the right brain wiring, a closing window of opportunity in early childhood, and quite possibly the right genetic mutation, all lining up at some point in our deep past. Maybe the most unsettling part isn't that we don't know when it happened. It's that every conversation you've ever had, every argument, every joke, every "I love you," all trace back to that one unknown moment when a mutation, a gesture, or a sound first connected one human mind to another. What do you think came first? The words, or the need to be understood? Let me know in the comments. And if you want the next video where I dig into why Neanderthals went extinct while we survived, hit subscribe so you don't miss it.